In 1910, in the heart of Chicago, an unsettling experiment took place behind the high, unforgiving walls of a prison. The experiment, known only to a few at the time and buried in secrecy for years, would forever alter the faces and the lives of the inmates who were involved. What was initially presented as a cutting-edge scientific study quickly descended into a terrifying exploration of the human psyche and the limits of morality. The prisoners involved were stripped of their dignity, their identities forever changed by a procedure that no one truly understood, but one that was born from the complex intersection of science, psychology, and the growing wave of eugenic thought that gripped America in the early 20th century. As the years passed, the official story of the experiment was swept under the rug. Those who dared to uncover it found themselves faced with vague denials, silenced voices, and lost records. It became a shadow in the history of science, a forgotten chapter, but a deeply disturbing one. The prisoners' lives, and the grotesque transformations they underwent, were not just the result of an unethical experiment. They were the silent scream of an era that valued scientific progress over human life. Imagine, for a moment, the eerie quiet of a prison at night, the walls lined with shadows, and the cold flicker of gas lamps casting long, grotesque silhouettes across the stone floors. Inmates shuffled about in their cells, their faces drawn tight with the anxiety of confinement. Among them, a group of men were about to undergo something unimaginable, an experiment that would alter their faces and, ultimately, their futures. These were not just prisoners. They were guinea pigs in a brutal test of science's power to shape humanity. Their lives would be changed in ways they never expected, and in ways that no one could have predicted. At the heart of this experiment was a question that fascinated many at the time. Could science truly reshape the human body? Could it alter the very thing that made a person who they were, their physical form? And more disturbingly, could this experiment change the course of their identity? In the early 1900s, many scientists were obsessed with the idea that criminal behavior could be measured, that the criminal mind could be understood and even corrected through physical alteration. This wasn't just a matter of improving health or alleviating suffering. It was a matter of transforming one's very nature, an idea born from the pseudoscience of the day, heavily influenced by eugenics. The man behind the experiment was a physician with an interest in criminology. He believed that by altering the prisoners' faces, specifically through surgeries and other invasive procedures, he could somehow fix the deep-rooted criminal impulses within them. He was not alone in this belief. The early 20th century was a time of great optimism about the power of science, especially in the fields of genetics and psychology. Scientists were increasingly convinced that crime could be predicted, and perhaps even prevented, through physiological changes. But this idealistic vision often clashed with the dark reality of what such experiments entailed. The experiment was not as benign as it might sound. In fact, it was downright barbaric. Prisoners were subjected to harsh procedures, often without proper anesthesia or medical care. They were poked, prodded, and altered in ways that no one should have ever been allowed to endure. Their faces, once ordinary, were surgically altered, skin removed, features rearranged, muscles shifted. The changes were so severe that some of the men were unrecognizable afterward. But these drastic changes weren't just physical. They became a visual manifestation of the prison system's power over the inmates, an embodiment of their dehumanization. The prisoners themselves were mostly poor, uneducated, and powerless in the face of these cruel experiments. Were they willing participants? Or had they been coerced? The truth remains unclear, but what is known is that they were left with scars that went beyond the surface. Their faces may have been altered, but so too were their lives, forever marked by the aftermath of what was done to them. Some of them would never recover from the psychological trauma of the experiment. For many, the damage to their identities was as severe as the physical wounds they endured. The scientists and prison officials who conducted the experiment were quick to justify their actions. They argued that this was a step forward in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, that these prisoners were part of something bigger, something that could, in time, benefit society as a whole. But the line between science and exploitation became dangerously blurred. In a world where moral boundaries were constantly being tested, these prisoners became the ultimate victims of an unchecked desire for progress. What they didn't know at the time, and what we can now see with the clarity of hindsight, is that they were being used as tools in an experiment that could not be justified by any amount of science. As the years went on, the details of this horrific experiment began to surface, though not without significant resistance from those who wanted to bury the truth. Records were destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and the full extent of what had happened remained hidden for decades. The stories of those who lived through it, the men who had their faces, and their futures, changed forever, were largely ignored by the scientific community. The experiment was erased from the annals of history, as if it had never happened. But even as time passed and the details of the experiment grew more elusive, the consequences of it continued to haunt the lives of the men who had been subjected to it. Their altered appearances weren't just physical, they were a constant reminder of a time when science went too far. For some, the changes left them estranged from society. They were outcasts, their faces reflecting the trauma they had endured, a permanent scar of their involvement in a dark chapter of history. It wasn't until much later that some of the horrific truths about the experiment began to emerge. Journalists, historians, and researchers, driven by a desire to uncover the buried secrets of the past, began to dig into the mystery. They found remnants of old medical records, hidden letters, and testimonies that painted a disturbing picture of what had truly happened. But even now, with the passage of more than a century, much of the experiment's full extent remains unknown. Some details are lost to time, others are intentionally concealed, left to linger in the shadow of history. Today, the 1910 Chicago prison experiment serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. It is a stark illustration of how easily the pursuit of knowledge can be twisted when it is no longer guided by ethics, compassion, or respect for human dignity. What was once seen as a progressive step forward in the field of criminology has become an example of the dark side of scientific experimentation, where the line between innovation and cruelty can blur in the most disturbing ways. This forgotten chapter in history serves as a warning. It is a reminder that, while science can lead to great advancements, it must always be tempered with morality and a deep respect for the individuals who make such progress possible. The prisoners who underwent this horrifying experiment were not just subjects of an outdated and harmful scientific ideology, they were human beings who paid an unimaginable price for the mistakes of those who claimed to know what was best for them. In the early 1900s, Chicago was a city teeming with contradictions. On the surface, it was a rapidly growing urban hub, filled with the sounds of industry, innovation, and progress. The city had long been a focal point for America's Industrial Revolution, a place where steel met ambition and the American dream seemed within reach for many. Yet, beneath this veneer of prosperity, there was a stark and troubling reality, an underbelly of poverty, crime, and social unrest. The city's rapid urbanization had created an overcrowded, divided society, and within this division, the prison system played a significant role. Prisons in early 20th century Chicago were grim places, both physically and morally. They were overcrowded, with deplorable conditions that left little to be desired by way of rehabilitation or reform. The buildings themselves were cold, oppressive structures, with iron bars and stone walls that seemed to breathe despair. Yet, for all their shortcomings, these institutions were essential parts of the city's infrastructure, housing thousands of inmates, many of whom were imprisoned for petty crimes, poverty-driven offenses, or actions deemed criminal by a society that was rapidly changing. The harsh reality of the time was that once someone entered the criminal justice system, they were seen more as a tool for labor or a threat to society than as an individual with inherent rights or dignity. At the turn of the century, Chicago's criminal justice system, like much of the nation's, was deeply influenced by the rising tide of scientific thought, particularly in the fields of criminology, psychology, and eugenics. There was a widespread belief that criminal behavior was not merely a matter of individual moral failing, but could be understood, predicted, and even fixed through the study of biology and genetics. It was a time when the burgeoning field of eugenics, which sought to improve human genetics through selective breeding and sterilization, was gaining considerable influence in the United States. These ideas, though controversial today, were considered by many to be legitimate scientific approaches to solving social problems. Prisoners, particularly those with criminal histories, were increasingly viewed as cases to be studied and potentially reformed through scientific means. This was the age of phrenology, the pseudoscience that believed the shape of a person's skull could reveal their criminal tendencies, and criminal anthropology, which posited that certain physical traits could indicate a predisposition to crime. While these theories have long since been debunked, they were at the heart of early criminological practices. Scientists and lawmakers, many of them eager to find a concrete explanation for criminal behavior, began to turn to the prison population as a laboratory of sorts, an isolated group where they could test their ideas. The early 20th century also saw the rise of psychological theories about criminal behavior, particularly the idea that criminals could be reformed if their minds were properly shaped. Yet, rather than focusing on rehabilitation through education or therapy, many in the scientific and medical communities were more concerned with altering the physical makeup of those they deemed to be criminal. The prevailing thought was that if the body could be modified, whether through surgery, chemical alteration, or other invasive techniques, then the mind might follow suit, and the criminal impulses would be eliminated. Amid this fervor for scientific advancement, Chicago was home to several influential figures who would play pivotal roles in shaping the future of criminology and criminal justice reform. The city had long been a breeding ground for progressive social movements, but also a place where darker, more disturbing ideas were allowed to flourish. It was here that an ambitious and somewhat controversial physician would begin to implement an experiment that would eventually haunt both the history of science and the lives of the men who became its subjects. The physician behind the experiment, whose name has been obscured by time, was a man deeply entrenched in the growing fields of criminology and eugenics. He believed that by altering the physical features of certain prisoners, he could change their very nature and prevent them from committing further crimes. Drawing upon the prevailing eugenic ideology, he argued that criminal tendencies were not merely a result of social conditions or moral choices, but could be corrected through physical transformation. The idea was rooted in the belief that criminals could be distinguished by their physical appearance, whether through facial features, body type, or other perceived markers of deviance. This physician's work was considered to be part of a larger, national trend of scientific approaches to crime prevention, which often focused on physical and genetic factors rather than social reform. However, while some saw the physician's work as progressive, others viewed it with deep skepticism. The concept of altering the body to change behavior was not new, but the ethical implications were enormous. Yet, in a world where the criminal justice system was rife with corruption and brutality, where prisons were overcrowded and underfunded, and where there was little regard for rehabilitation, the idea of using science to reshape the body, if not the soul, seemed almost like a solution. The idea that one could correct a prisoner's criminality through surgery or physical modification offered a glimmer of hope, or at least a distraction from the much more difficult work of addressing the systemic issues that caused crime in the first place. The physician's experiment would unfold within the walls of a Chicago prison, where a select group of prisoners were chosen for the procedure. These men were not volunteers in the traditional sense. Many were coerced or promised rewards for their participation. Some may have believed they were part of a noble scientific endeavor, while others may have simply wanted to escape the harsh conditions of the prison, where death and disease were constant companions. The experiment itself would involve a series of drastic and invasive procedures aimed at altering the prisoner's physical appearances. Some would have their faces surgically changed, with features such as the nose, jaw, or cheekbones reshaped. Others might undergo more extreme alterations to their bodies, designed to make them conform to the physician's ideal of what a reformed criminal should look like. These transformations, while scientifically unsound and morally reprehensible by modern standards, were presented to the inmates as part of a grand experiment, an attempt to erase their criminality and give them a chance at a new life. The procedures were not without their risks. Prisoners were subjected to painful surgeries with minimal medical care, and the complications were severe. Infections, disfigurement, and even death became real possibilities for those unlucky enough to be part of the experiment. Yet, despite the gruesome nature of the work, the physician and his team pressed on, believing that they were conducting important, groundbreaking research that could have a lasting impact on both the scientific community and society at large. At the same time, the larger social and political climate in Chicago was beginning to change. The city's rapidly expanding industrial base and growing immigrant population created new social tensions, and crime began to rise as well. The prison system, once a place of punishment, was now increasingly viewed as a mechanism for reform, or at least containment. But the reality of reform was starkly different from the idealistic fantasies held by some reformers. The experimental nature of the work done within the walls of the prison reflected the deeper issues with the criminal justice system, that it was often more about control and punishment than actual rehabilitation or social improvement. In this dark, volatile environment, the physician's experiment began to take shape, pushing the boundaries of ethical science. The consequences of this experiment, both for the prisoners involved and for the larger world of scientific inquiry, would echo for years to come. Yet, at the time, it was seen as just another step in the misguided quest to fix human nature through physical means, unaware of the lasting psychological, social, and historical scars it would leave behind. The story of the 1910 Chicago prison experiment begins with a man driven by an unshakable belief in his ability to reshape humanity, or at least the minds of those he saw as society's failures. His name has been lost to history, but his vision has left an indelible mark on the shadowy intersections of criminology, psychology, and human experimentation. The physician behind this dark chapter was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was not motivated by cruelty or malice, but rather by an unyielding faith in the power of science to fix the human condition. His belief in the transformative potential of science was part of a larger societal mindset, one that saw human behavior as a set of problems to be solved, much like a mechanical puzzle. And for him, the prisoners were the perfect subjects for his grand experiment. At a time when scientific advancements were seen as infallible, and when the social and moral conditions surrounding criminality were still in their infancy, this physician came to represent the idea that biology, more than social context, determined who people were. He was a product of his time, operating within a society that often treated the poor and marginalized as subjects for experimentation rather than as individuals deserving of respect and dignity. His methods were rooted in the early 20th century belief that criminal tendencies could be biologically predisposed and, through scientific intervention, eliminated. This belief in the malleability of the human body and mind was heavily influenced by the growing field of eugenics, which sought to improve the human race through selective breeding and the elimination of traits deemed undesirable. For many, including the physician, the physical features of criminals were seen as markers of an inherent, unchangeable flaw. Criminality, it was believed, could be determined by the shape of the skull, the size of the jaw, or the alignment of the facial features. These theories, though rooted in the pseudoscience of the day, were compelling to those in positions of power. The idea that one could physically alter a person to prevent future crimes seemed like a revolutionary breakthrough, one that could reshape society itself. The physician's vision was to prove that by altering these physical traits, he could not only make prisoners more acceptable to society but also reform their very nature. He believed that the men in prison, by virtue of their crimes, had somehow been born with a genetic flaw, a flaw that could be corrected through surgical means. He had studied the works of the great minds of his time, men who believed that criminality was as physical as it was mental, and was convinced that if he could alter the outward appearance of these men, he could alter their inner character. This was not a mere matter of aesthetics. To him, changing their faces was synonymous with changing their behavior. The physician's reasoning was simple: if misguided, the body and the mind were intertwined, and by changing one, the other could be transformed. He saw the prisoners as nothing more than raw material, a blank canvas on which he could experiment with his theories. And, like so many scientists of his era, he rationalized his actions by appealing to the higher cause of scientific progress. The men involved in the experiment were seen not as victims, but as participants in a great scientific project that would ultimately benefit society. They were viewed as sacrifices for the greater good, expendable bodies in the name of progress. It was a cold and clinical outlook, one that stripped the inmates of their humanity in favor of an abstract pursuit of knowledge. It is important to understand that at this time, the concept of informed consent was barely in its infancy. The ethical considerations that are so central to modern-day scientific research were not even a consideration. Prisoners, many of whom were illiterate and marginalized, were rarely consulted about the nature of the experiments they were involved in. The idea that these men had a right to refuse or understand the consequences of the procedures was not part of the scientific or medical discourse of the day. In fact, the very notion that these individuals should be treated as autonomous beings with their own rights was not widely accepted. For the physician and his colleagues, the prisoners were tools to be used, not people with dignity. The selection process for the experiment was as cruel as it was arbitrary. These were not volunteers in the modern sense. Rather, they were inmates who were chosen for the experiment based on factors that had nothing to do with their willingness to participate. Some were selected because they had committed more violent crimes, while others were chosen because they seemed to fit the doctor's preconceived notions of what a criminal looked like. The choices were based on physical characteristics: the shape of the face, the set of the jaw, the curvature of the nose, traits that were thought to indicate a criminal predisposition. In many cases, the prisoners had no idea what they were about to undergo. They were not informed of the full extent of the procedures they would endure, nor were they given any real agency in the matter. The experiment began with promises of improvement, of a second chance at life outside the prison walls. The physician's rhetoric was compelling, using the language of progress and science to mask the reality of what was about to unfold. The prisoners were told that the procedures would help them overcome their criminal tendencies and perhaps, one day, reintegrate into society as reformed men. It was a lie, one that many of them, desperate for a sense of hope, were willing to believe. But as the experiment progressed, it became clear that the true purpose of the procedure was not rehabilitation but a deeper, more disturbing manipulation of the human body and mind. The process itself was invasive and violent. Surgical procedures were performed without the use of modern anesthetics, meaning that the prisoners had to endure excruciating pain as their faces were altered. Skin was removed, bones were reshaped, and muscles were repositioned, often with little regard for the long-term consequences. The idea was that these physical changes would somehow correct the prisoner's criminal instincts, but the reality was far more horrific. Many of the men were left with disfigured faces, unable to return to their previous lives, either because of the physical changes or the stigma that followed them. The pain of the surgery was nothing compared to the emotional and psychological toll it took. The idea of being a new man, reformed and redeemed, was shattered as they faced the harsh truth that their appearance could be altered, but their sense of self could not. As the prisoners underwent their procedures, some began to question the doctor's motives, but by then it was too late. The physician's power over them was absolute. The experiment continued, fueled by the belief that the body could be reshaped into a more moral form, that the criminal could be eradicated from within. Yet as the weeks and months passed, it became clear that this was no simple experiment. It was a manifestation of society's darkest fears and its willingness to use science as a means of control. For the doctor, the success or failure of the experiment was not measured in terms of the prisoner's well-being, but by the physical changes that took place. His belief in his own theories blinded him to the human suffering he was causing. To him, the prisoners were simply cases to be studied, numbers in a larger, grander scheme to understand crime and punishment. They were not victims of an unethical experiment. They were mere data points in his quest for scientific validation. In this dark intersection of science, criminality, and human dignity, the prisoners were the ultimate casualties. Their suffering became part of a much larger narrative, one that was driven by the belief that science could and should intervene in the most intimate aspects of human life, even at the cost of the individual's autonomy. And for the men who were chosen, their lives would never be the same. They were not just altered physically, but emotionally and psychologically, and the effects of this experiment would ripple through their lives long after the doctor's work had come to an end. What began as a hope for redemption turned into a nightmare they could never escape. The experiment began in a cold, sterile room within the prison's medical ward, where the reality of what was about to unfold was becoming ever clearer to the prisoners who had been selected. These men, many of whom had already been scarred by years of incarceration and the hardships of prison life, now found themselves at the mercy of a physician whose motivations were not fully understood. The promises of reformation and new beginnings quickly began to sound less like hope and more like the whispered prelude to a horrifying ordeal. For the prisoners, the first moment they were told of the experiment was met with confusion and unease. Many had heard rumors, vague whispers of something happening behind the closed doors of the medical ward, but no one could truly grasp the full scope of the experiment. They had been promised some form of medical procedure that could improve them, but most thought it would be something minor, perhaps a treatment for their ailments, or a simple cosmetic procedure to fix physical deformities that had been caused by years of prison life. The idea that they were to undergo drastic changes that would alter their very identity, was beyond their comprehension. The physician, with his confident and authoritative tone, assured them that these alterations would be for the best. He spoke of redemption, of a future beyond the prison walls, a chance to reintegrate into society as law-abiding citizens. He made promises of transformation, but the reality was far darker. This was not about rehabilitation. This was not about offering a second chance. The experiment was, in essence, about control, the control of the body, of the mind, and of the very identity of the men who found themselves under his knife. The procedures began swiftly, without much in the way of preparation or warning. The prisoners were wheeled into the makeshift operating rooms, their nerves already frayed from the uncertainty of what was to come. They had little understanding of the physical toll that would be taken on them. The surgeries were invasive and often brutal. There were no sterilized environments, no modern medical tools or anesthesia that would make the experience bearable. Instead, they were subjected to painful, crude operations that stripped them of their dignity and their bodies. The first phase of the procedure involved the alteration of the facial features. For many of the prisoners, their faces were the most identifiable aspect of who they were. It was through their faces that the world perceived them, whether as criminals, as outcasts, or as men condemned by their past actions. To have their faces changed was to have their very identity stripped away. This was not a simple cosmetic surgery, where a few minor adjustments could be made. This was a complete reconstruction, a physical mutilation designed to erase their past and replace it with something unrecognizable, something new and acceptable in the eyes of society. The surgeries were performed with an alarming sense of urgency. The physician, with his team of assistants, worked quickly, using rudimentary instruments to slice through skin and bone, to reshape and resculpt the prisoners' faces. The pain was excruciating. There was no anesthesia to dull the suffering, only the cold, sterile feeling of steel instruments digging into flesh, of skin being pulled and contorted into new, unnatural shapes. The prisoners were awake for much of the procedure, their cries of agony echoing in the sterile room as the work continued. But their suffering seemed secondary to the physician's goal, to change them, to remold them into something more acceptable, more reformed. For some, the changes were subtle, small shifts in the structure of the face, perhaps the reshaping of the nose or the recontouring of the jaw. But for others, the alterations were extreme. Whole sections of their faces were restructured, sometimes so drastically that they were barely recognizable as the men they had once been. The process was not just about physical change, it was about erasing their past identities, about creating a new version of the self that fit into the distorted, eugenic ideals of what a reformed criminal should look like. As the surgeries continued, many of the men began to experience intense psychological distress. It was not just the physical pain that hurt them, but the realization that their very sense of self was being torn apart. Faces, like names, are integral to identity. They are the first things people see, the first way they make judgments about a person. By altering their faces, the physician was not just changing their appearance, he was changing how they were perceived by the world. More importantly, he was altering how they saw themselves. The prisoners who had once been defined by their criminal actions were now being defined by their physical transformations. But this new identity was not one they had chosen. It was forced upon them, carved into their flesh without consent. In the days and weeks that followed, the physical recovery from these surgeries was slow and painful. The wounds were often poorly treated, leading to infections and scarring. But the emotional recovery was even more difficult. The prisoners who had undergone the procedures were left to wrestle with their new faces, their new bodies, and the loss of everything they had once known about themselves. Many were left in a state of confusion, struggling to reconcile their former selves with their new, altered appearances. Some prisoners found that they could no longer recognize themselves in mirrors. The face they saw staring back at them was not the one they had known for years. It was a strange, unfamiliar version of themselves. The psychological toll of this was profound. How does a man reconcile his inner identity with a face that no longer matches it? How does he live with the knowledge that he has been physically altered in the name of science, with no real understanding of what that means for his future? For others, the emotional toll was less about recognition and more about social rejection. The changes to their appearance, while intended to make them more acceptable, often had the opposite effect. They were no longer seen as the men they once were, and society refused to accept them, despite the changes to their physical forms. The stigma of being a former prisoner remained, and in many ways, the alterations only served to deepen the sense of alienation and despair that these men felt. Their new faces, designed to be a symbol of reform, became instead a symbol of their enduring suffering. They were now outcasts in a world that refused to accept them, no matter how much their bodies had been reshaped. The physician's intentions, however misguided, had been clear. He sought to change the men physically, believing that this would somehow change their behavior, their thoughts, and their souls. But what he failed to understand was that identity is not something that can be surgically removed and replaced. It is a complex, layered thing, rooted in history, experience, and the way we see ourselves in the world. The prisoners who underwent this procedure were not just altered physically, they were torn apart emotionally and psychologically. They were victims of an experiment that sought to reshape them into something they were not, and in doing so, they were left without any clear sense of who they were, or could ever be. In the end, the experiment's results were a tragic reminder of the limits of science when it is applied without regard for humanity. The scars left on the prisoners' bodies were visible, but the scars left on their minds were far deeper. They were men whose faces had been altered, but who had not been given the opportunity to truly change. Their faces may have been reconstructed, but their sense of self had been shattered in the process. What began as an attempt to create something new had instead destroyed what little sense of identity they had left. And for the physician, whose belief in his own methods never wavered, it was a dark, haunting lesson in the dangers of believing that science could cure all ills, especially when it was applied without compassion or understanding. As the experiment unfolded, the prisoners who were subjected to the grueling procedures began to grapple with not only the physical pain but the psychological turmoil that came with their altered identities. While many of them had come into the prison system with prior histories of criminal activity, their lives before incarceration were often more complex than a simple label of criminal. The physician, in his clinical detachment, had failed to account for the depth of human experience and the intricate web of circumstances that had shaped each man. To him, these men were nothing more than subjects for an experiment, faceless victims of their supposed genetic flaws. But for the prisoners, the effects of the experiment would stretch far beyond the physical changes to their bodies. They would be marked by an internal transformation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Before the experiment, these men had come from a wide range of backgrounds. Some had committed violent crimes, but others had been incarcerated for lesser offenses, often stemming from the harsh realities of poverty, neglect, or social disadvantage. They had been born into lives where opportunities were scarce and choices were limited. Their actions, while criminal, were often born out of survival rather than malice. In many ways, their crimes were more a product of their environment than their inherent nature. But the physician, along with the prevailing criminological theories of the time, saw only one thing: the outward signs of a criminal nature, which they believed could be corrected through physical transformation. The first time the men were told they would be part of the experiment, they had little idea what it would entail. Some may have heard rumors about the procedures, but most of them assumed it would be a minor medical intervention, perhaps a cosmetic surgery to improve their appearance or treat scars and deformities from previous life experiences. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. After all, the idea of escaping the grinding poverty and hopelessness of prison life, even in exchange for some physical alteration, seemed like a fair trade. What they didn't know was that they were about to undergo a series of surgeries that would alter the very essence of who they were. When the surgeries began, the men were subjected to invasive, painful procedures, which involved reshaping their faces and bodies. This was no simple cosmetic procedure. It was a complete overhaul of their physical identities. Their features were drastically altered, sometimes so much so that they could barely recognize themselves in mirrors. The process was crude by modern standards, carried out in an environment far from the sterile, controlled settings we associate with surgery today. The men were not given adequate anesthesia, and many of them were fully aware of the excruciating pain as their faces were cut, pulled, and reconstructed. The physical changes were so dramatic that, in some cases, they were barely recognizable to the people who had known them before. The transformations were intended to erase what the physicians saw as their criminal appearance. But in doing so, they erased the very foundation of the men's sense of self. These were not just facial surgeries. They were attempts to rewrite the men's identities entirely. The face, as they all knew, was a reflection of who they were, a window into their soul, their past, and their future. To change it was to change everything. It was an act of violence against their very existence. But the impact of the surgeries was not confined to the physical realm. The emotional and psychological toll was far more profound. Imagine the experience of looking into a mirror and seeing someone you don't recognize staring back at you. Your reflection no longer matches the person you once were, and you can't help but feel that something crucial has been taken from you. For the prisoners, this experience was a devastating shock to their already fragile identities. The physical changes made it impossible to connect with their past selves, to hold on to the person they once were, and to reconcile that person with the person they were being forced to become. The psychological effects of the experiment were immediate and devastating. Many of the men who underwent the procedures began to experience intense feelings of confusion and loss. They no longer recognized their own faces, and in turn, they no longer recognized themselves. Who were they now? What did they represent? They were prisoners, yes, but they had also been men with names, with histories, with families. They were now reduced to mere subjects in a grand experiment, stripped of everything that made them human. They had become, in a sense, empty vessels, their identities forcibly erased by a physician who believed he could reshape them as if they were clay. The disfiguring surgeries were only part of the trauma these men endured. After the operations, many of them were left with permanent scars, both physical and emotional. The facial alterations, while intended to make them look more reformed or less criminal, often left them with a sense of alienation that went far beyond their prison walls. They could not escape their disfigurement, and neither could society. These men, whose faces had been so dramatically altered, were now faced with a new and terrifying reality. They were outcasts in a world that would never accept them. The scars on their faces were constant reminders of the surgeries, and the social stigma that followed them was even more damaging. These men, who had already been ostracized by society for their crimes, now found themselves rejected even more violently by the outside world. Their new faces, which were supposed to symbolize their redemption, instead became markers of their suffering. They were branded as victims of a failed experiment, and the stigma they faced was not just about their criminal past but about their role as subjects in a grotesque medical procedure. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this experiment was the fact that the prisoners had no real control over their fates. They were told that the surgeries would improve their chances of reintegration into society, that they would be given a second chance to live outside the prison walls. But this was nothing more than a lie. The prison experiment, which had promised so much, had delivered little more than pain, humiliation, and despair. No amount of physical transformation could erase the shame they now carried, nor could it change the fact that they were still prisoners, still seen as less than human by society. For some, the pain of the surgeries and the emotional trauma they suffered was too much to bear. Some of the men fell into deep depression, struggling to come to terms with what had been done to them. Others became consumed with anger and bitterness, lashing out at the world that had subjected them to such an ordeal. It was a cruel irony that, in their pursuit of reform, they had been pushed further into the margins of society, rejected not only for their past crimes but for the surgeries that were supposed to help them. While the physician and his team may have seen the experiment as a success, a step forward in the study of criminology and eugenics, there was no escaping the harsh reality. The prisoners were no better off than they had been before. The physical changes did nothing to cure their criminal instincts, and they left the men broken, disconnected from their pasts and rejected by the society they hoped to rejoin. In the end, the experiment's true cost was not measured in the reshaping of faces or the alteration of criminal tendencies. The true cost was the destruction of human dignity, the erasure of identity in the name of science. The prisoners who had endured the experiment were left to wrestle with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Some of them, despite the physical and emotional scars, managed to rebuild their lives after their release from prison. But for many, the trauma was too deep to overcome. They were forever marked by the experiment, both in body and in mind. They had been changed in ways they could not control, and the impact of that change would echo through their lives, long after the experiment itself had been forgotten. In their quest for reform, they had lost everything that made them human, and in the process, the world had lost sight of what it truly meant to be redeemed. As the aftermath of the experiment unfolded, the reality of its consequences began to sink in for both the prisoners and the scientific community. The immediate results of the surgeries were visible: altered faces, scarred bodies, and men whose identities had been irrevocably changed. But what became increasingly apparent was the deeper, more insidious toll the experiment had taken. The long-term psychological damage, the social rejection, and the enduring sense of alienation that followed were much harder to quantify but left scars just as permanent as the ones on the faces. For the prisoners, the physical changes were only part of their ordeal. Once the surgeries were over, they were left to recover in the cold, clinical environment of the prison's medical ward, a place that had already stripped them of their autonomy. The men were not given the opportunity to reflect on what had happened to them, nor were they provided with any support to help them process the trauma they had endured. There were no counselors, no psychological evaluations, no attempts at rehabilitation through therapy or community reintegration. They were simply left to heal, physically, but never emotionally, from the ordeal they had been subjected to. As their faces healed and their scars began to fade, the true extent of the trauma they had suffered became more apparent. These men had been altered so drastically that they could no longer recognize themselves. The emotional and psychological toll of seeing their reflection in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back was profound. Faces are the most powerful markers of identity. They are the first thing people notice and the way we express our emotions, our fears, our personalities. When a person undergoes a dramatic change in their appearance, it is not just a cosmetic shift, it is a complete transformation of how they view themselves and how they believe others view them. For the prisoners who had undergone these invasive procedures, this was a devastating blow to their sense of self. The disfigurement left many of them feeling utterly disconnected from their former lives. They had already been stripped of their freedom and their dignity through the prison system, and now their faces, their most recognizable features, had been torn away from them as well. For some, it was as if they had ceased to exist as the people they once were. Their past crimes, which had already marked them as outcasts, were now compounded by a physical transformation that made it impossible for them to reintegrate into society. They had been made into something unrecognizable, something less human in their eyes, and yet they were forced to face a world that rejected them not only for their past actions but for their altered appearances. This was where the true cruelty of the experiment lay. The idea that physical change could lead to a change in behavior, in morality, in identity, was fatally flawed. The experiments had no real understanding of the psychological complexities of human nature, nor did they take into account the deep-seated emotional needs of the prisoners. These men had committed crimes, but they were not animals to be reformed through surgery. They were human beings, with histories, experiences, and emotions. To alter their faces and assume that their criminal instincts could simply be erased was a monumental misunderstanding of what it meant to be a person. Even worse, society had little compassion for these men once the procedures were complete. They were not offered the chance to heal mentally or emotionally. Instead, they were discarded back into the world with faces that didn't belong to them, and with the same criminal labels they had carried before. The promise of reintegration into society was nothing more than a cruel illusion. The changes to their physical appearances, which were supposed to make them more acceptable in the eyes of others, instead made them even more of an enigma. No one knew who they were anymore, not even they themselves. For many of the men, their faces became a permanent reminder of their suffering. They could not go out into the world without feeling the weight of their new identities. They were no longer individuals with names and histories, but instead grotesque remnants of an experiment gone wrong. In the streets, people would recoil when they saw them, not knowing whether to pity them or fear them. There was no place for these men in the world that had once been theirs. Their families, if they were still alive, did not recognize them. Their friends, if they had any, turned away in confusion and fear. The men had become ghostly figures, trapped in a world that no longer had any room for them. In the years that followed, the physical and emotional scars of the experiment did not fade. The men who had survived the procedures lived in a state of constant psychological distress. Some attempted to rebuild their lives, but their altered appearances proved to be an insurmountable barrier. They were rejected by society, not only because of their criminal pasts but because of their new, disfigured faces. Those who sought work were often turned away, unable to find employment because their faces were no longer acceptable by societal standards. Many of them were left to drift into obscurity, forgotten by the world that had once been so eager to label them criminals. It wasn't just the world outside the prison that rejected them. The men also had to struggle with a deep sense of self-loathing. When they looked in the mirror, they no longer saw the person they once were. They saw someone else, someone strange and unrecognizable. Their physical transformation was so extreme that it left them disconnected from their own identities. They could no longer remember who they had been, and they certainly couldn't reconcile who they were now with who they had once been. The psychological fallout from this disconnect was immense. Some men experienced severe depression, unable to cope with the fact that they were living in a body that did not reflect their true selves. Others became bitter, angry at the world for what they had been subjected to. Their lives, once full of potential, were now marked by pain, confusion, and alienation. The experiment, which had promised so much, had delivered nothing but suffering. There was no redemption for these men. Their faces had been altered, but their pasts, their identities, had not been erased. The physician who had conducted the experiment had believed that he could reshape the criminal mind by reshaping the criminal body, but he had failed to see that the mind and body are inextricably linked. To change the body was to alter the man's experience of the world, but it could not change the fundamental nature of his being. Criminality, like any aspect of human behavior, is not simply a matter of appearance. It is deeply tied to upbringing, environment, psychology, and circumstances. The experiment had overlooked all of these complexities, focusing instead on the simplistic and deeply flawed notion that physical change could cure moral flaws. The scars that these men carried were not just on their faces, but in their minds. They were left with the psychological burden of having been subjected to an experiment that treated them as less than human, as mere subjects to be altered in the name of science. The emotional trauma of what they had endured lingered long after the physical wounds had healed. Their lives were forever changed, not for the better, but for the worse. The experiment had taken away their sense of identity, their place in society, and in many cases, their dignity. Years later, as more information about the experiment began to surface, the world was horrified by what had been done. But by then, the men who had been the subjects of this cruel test were largely forgotten. Some had died in obscurity, their lives ending as quietly as they had lived. Others had disappeared into the shadows, unwilling or unable to face the world that had turned its back on them. And for those who remained, the scars of the 1910 experiment could never be erased. What was meant to be a scientific advancement had instead become a tragic chapter in the history of human experimentation, a reminder of the dangers of using science as a tool of control and the importance of understanding the deep, complex nature of the human experience. As the years passed, the consequences of the 1910 Chicago prison experiment became an unsettling chapter in the history of unethical scientific practices. Though the names of the men involved faded into obscurity, the shadows of their suffering lingered long after the experiment had ended. Society, too, moved on, turning its attention to new advancements in criminology, psychology, and medical science. But for those who had endured the horrifying surgeries, their lives had been forever altered. The experiment had not only failed to achieve its lofty goals of reforming criminal behavior through physical alteration, but it had also left behind a legacy of suffering and trauma. In the wake of the experiment's conclusion, those who had survived the procedures were left to deal with the aftermath, and it was clear that they were not equipped to cope with the profound effects the surgeries had on their lives. The men, once defined by their criminal acts, had been remade in ways they could neither understand nor control. They had been transformed into something unrecognizable, not just in appearance, but in the very core of their identities. The changes to their faces had been so extreme that it was no longer possible for them to fit back into the world they had once known. Many of the men who had undergone the procedures were left to live in isolation. Their altered appearances had made them unrecognizable to friends, family, and even fellow prisoners. They had been subjected to a transformation so severe that they were no longer welcome in the world they had come from. The prison system, which had once been their home, was no longer a refuge. It had become a place of abandonment. They were no longer inmates, but outcasts in a world that had no place for them. The hopes of reintegration into society had been shattered, and the promise of rehabilitation was an illusion. The scars that these men carried went far beyond the physical. They were not just marked by the surgeries they had undergone, but by the psychological toll of having their identities erased and reconstructed. As time went on, many of them found it difficult to reconcile their new selves with their pasts. The very act of altering their faces had stripped away the few remaining connections to who they had been before their incarceration. Their past mistakes, their crimes, had been buried beneath layers of surgical alteration, but the emotional baggage that came with those crimes remained. The men had hoped that the physical changes would somehow cleanse them of their pasts, but they soon realized that their pasts could not be so easily erased. For many of them, the physical scars were only the beginning of a much deeper wound. The emotional toll of seeing their faces distorted, and of being forced to live with those changes, was profound. Each day, they had to face a world that rejected them not only because of their past crimes but also because of their altered appearances. The men who had once been defined by their criminal actions were now defined by something far worse in their eyes, their disfigured, unrecognizable selves. They had become ghosts of the men they had once been, trapped in bodies they could no longer call their own. The psychological effects of the experiment were long-lasting. The sense of alienation that followed them after their release from prison was overwhelming. In some cases, the men struggled with severe depression, unable to cope with the loss of their former selves. They had been reshaped physically, but the trauma of what they had endured remained. They had been made to feel as if their past mistakes were unforgivable, that they were somehow unworthy of redemption. Their new faces, which were meant to symbolize reform, instead served as a constant reminder of their suffering. The weight of this psychological burden was heavy, and for many, it was impossible to escape. Some of the men tried to rebuild their lives. They sought work, hoping to find employment and reintegrate into society. But their altered appearances made this nearly impossible. Employers, even those who were unaware of their criminal pasts, were often put off by their disfigurement. In the eyes of society, they were no longer human beings deserving of respect and dignity. They were experiments gone wrong, freaks of nature whose faces betrayed their troubled pasts. The dream of reintegration, of starting anew, was a cruel mirage. Every door that opened seemed to close just as quickly, and with each rejection, the men became more isolated and more hopeless. Others withdrew entirely from society, disappearing into obscurity. They found solace in isolation, retreating from a world that had shown them nothing but rejection. Some of them sought out other men who had undergone the same surgeries, hoping to find comfort in shared suffering. But even among themselves, they struggled to form meaningful connections. They were not the men they had been before the surgeries. They were someone else, someone whom even they could not fully understand. The trauma of what they had endured had left them scarred in ways that went beyond the physical. The families of the men who had undergone the experiment were often left in a similar state of confusion and grief. For those who had family members who were still alive, the men returned to their homes unrecognizable. They had been transformed in ways that their loved ones could not comprehend. A father who had been once known by his children was now a stranger, his face altered beyond recognition. Wives and mothers could not bring themselves to see the men they had once loved, now reduced to shadows of their former selves. The emotional disconnect between the men and their families was profound, and many of the prisoners found themselves abandoned, not just by society, but by the people who had once cared for them. What's more, the ethical implications of the experiment began to surface. As more details about the procedure came to light, there was growing outrage over the way the prisoners had been treated. In the early 20th century, the line between scientific progress and human rights was often blurred, but as the public became more aware of the horrors of the experiment, questions about consent, autonomy, and the use of human beings as subjects for cruel, experimental purposes gained prominence. How could this have happened? How could men who were already marginalized be subjected to such extreme measures in the name of science? What had the experiment truly achieved, beyond the mutilation of bodies and minds? As the outrage grew, so did the recognition that the men involved in the experiment had been victims of a system that saw them as little more than raw material for scientific inquiry. Their bodies had been altered without their consent, and they had been treated as tools for an experiment that was doomed to fail. The idea that these men had been given a second chance at life through the surgery was a lie. What they had been given was a life full of suffering, alienation, and despair. The experiment's failure did not go unnoticed, and over time, it became an example of the dangers of treating human beings as objects of experimentation, free from ethical considerations. It was a cautionary tale, a dark reminder that science, when divorced from empathy and humanity, can cause irreparable harm. For the men who had been subjected to this experiment, their suffering was a silent testament to the consequences of misguided scientific ambition. Eventually, as public awareness of the experiment grew, there were calls for accountability. The physician who had conducted the surgeries, along with the others involved in the experiment, faced scrutiny for their actions. But by then, the damage had already been done. The men who had been subjected to the surgeries were left to live with the consequences of those actions, and they would carry the scars of the experiment for the rest of their lives. In the end, the Chicago prison experiment was not a triumph of scientific advancement but a grim example of how science, when applied without compassion or ethical oversight, can lead to untold suffering. And for the men involved, their lives, once full of potential, had been forever marred by a misguided attempt to change who they were, both on the outside and on the inside. As the years passed and the wounds of the experiment remained, the survivors of the 1910 Chicago prison surgeries found themselves living in a world that could no longer recognize them. The experiment, once cloaked in the guise of scientific progress and eugenic ideals, had left them with scars that ran much deeper than their altered faces. Though the physical effects of the surgeries had healed to some degree, the psychological and social trauma they experienced continued to haunt them. Their lives, irrevocably changed by the surgeries, were forever shaped by the profound sense of disconnection and isolation that followed. The experiment's ultimate failure lay not in its lack of scientific rigor, but in the disregard for the very humanity of the men involved. These were not simply bodies to be reshaped for the sake of an ideological theory. These were individuals with histories, families, and identities. The scientific community at the time failed to recognize that human beings are more than the sum of their physical appearances. The surgeries, meant to erase the criminal face and replace it with something more acceptable, ignored the complexities of the mind and the psyche. It was an attempt to redefine criminality in a way that was not only flawed but deeply dangerous. By equating physical appearance with moral character, the experiment perpetuated a harmful ideology that criminalized individuals for the way they looked, rather than the choices they made. For the survivors of the experiment, life outside the prison walls was a nightmare. They had been promised that their new faces would give them a chance at reintegration, that their altered appearances would allow them to leave behind their criminal pasts and re-enter society as redeemed men. But the reality was far different. They had not been granted a second chance at life. They had been discarded by society, rejected by a world that saw them as nothing more than the living remnants of a failed experiment. Their faces, which had been altered to make them better, became their prison, trapping them in a cycle of rejection and alienation. Each day was a reminder that they were no longer the men they once were. Their families, if they had any left, struggled to recognize them. Wives, children, and parents who had once known them were confronted with strangers in the place of their loved ones. Even the men themselves could no longer recognize the faces that stared back at them in the mirror. The act of looking at oneself became an act of mourning, a painful reminder of what had been lost. What had once been familiar, the features that defined their identities, was now unfamiliar, foreign. It was not just their physical appearances that had been altered. It was the very core of who they were. The emotional consequences of this were severe. The survivors of the experiment were not just struggling with the loss of their former selves. They were grappling with the trauma of having been subjected to a cruel, dehumanizing procedure in the name of science. They had been treated as nothing more than subjects in a twisted experiment, their bodies violated without consent, their identities erased. The men were left to live with the deep, enduring pain of having been objectified and dehumanized. It wasn't just that their bodies had been altered. It was that they had been rendered powerless in the face of a system that saw them as little more than instruments of experimentation. The sense of isolation was perhaps the most profound aspect of their post-surgical lives. Though they were technically free from the confines of prison, they were more imprisoned than ever. Their altered appearances made it impossible to reintegrate into society. They were no longer seen as individuals, but as grotesque curiosities, as experiments gone wrong. The world outside the prison walls was no more accepting than the world inside had been. Society, which had once labeled them criminals, now rejected them entirely. They were seen as objects of pity, fear, and fascination, but never as human beings deserving of dignity.